Key concept 5.3, nationalism, revolution, and reform. So this is going to focus mostly on those revolutions, the Creole, the American, the French, and also some of the new changes, especially in the lives of workers. Also some of those isms, right? New ideologies like communism and utopian socialism. All right, key concept 5.31 states the rise and diffusion of Enlightenment thought that question established traditions in all area of life often preceded revolutions and rebellions against existing governments. So, you definitely want to use the Enlightenment as context to an essay about revolutions. The Enlightenment is mentioned, a number of times in both Unit 4 and 5. So you definitely want to be able to understand, it's a revolution in thought, right? You want to be able to identify some of those philosophers and some of their ideas, like John Locke. So subconcept A states the Enlightenment philosophers applied new ways of understanding the natural world to human relationships, encouraging observation and inference in all spheres of life. What that means is, you take the ideas of the scientific revolution, the idea of using reasoning and logic to help explain the natural world, and now these intellectuals are applying the same philosophies of logic and reasoning to, society and government. It continues by saying they also critique the role that religion played in public life, insisting on the importance of reason as opposed to revelation. Other Enlightenment philosophers developed new political ideas about the individual, natural rights, and the social contract. So, some key words there that you want to be familiar with. And also religion, right? These Enlightened philosophers were questioning traditional religions, right? And this is when deism kind of emerges. All right, so John Locke and Voltaire are two of these philosophers. As far as John Locke goes, remember his ideas on natural rights, right? We're born with those rights and they must be protected. And that's part of his social contract theory. Remember, Thomas Hobbes also believed in the social contract theory, but he believed the contract involved the government protecting the people, and in return, those people give up some rights. John Locke has a different idea about that contract, where if the government doesn't protect the rights, the people have a right to rebel. And his ideas are a big part of the Declaration of Independence. Voltaire, I think he's synonymous with freedom of religion. I think some of that ideal is going to also show up in our government in the form of the Bill of Rights. Also, freedom of speech. So he's kind of an advocate for freedoms. He was very critical of the Catholic Church, and he didn't believe in religion. He believed in he didn't believe in an organized religion, but he was a believer in the idea of a higher power, or God. Montesquieu, he's an easy one to remember. He's kind of the architect of separation of powers, and he was, he promoted the idea of different branches of government that could check each branch, right? He believed that the French society was the first estate was kind of out of control, right? And there wasn't really a division of power. Mary Wollstonecraft was an early feminist, a woman's rights advocate. She wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women. That's, I think, a great philosopher to remember as well. Deism. So we talked about how philosophers rejected traditional religion in a sense, where, it's not that they didn't believe in God, they just didn't believe that this supreme being controlled our lives day to day. He believed that, like a clockmaker, right? The watchmaker makes the watch, but then, that's it. He doesn't really, oversee that watch. He didn't, deists didn't believe in religious rules. And both Ben Franklin and Voltaire were deists. So they're questioning again, religion in our daily lives. Not that there isn't an all-power, a God or creator. It's just that creator doesn't, get involved again, in our day-to-day life. You should also be familiar with some of these enlightened despots. Basically, that is a ruler, an autocratic ruler who might be looking to reform and help the people in some way, right? So, for example, Catherine the Great was an example of that, where she continues Peter's reforms. She also studied the philosophers. Napoleon Bonaparte, I think, is the perfect example. He ruled as an emperor. It was not a democratic France, but he did try to improve education. He had a set of laws, the Napoleonic codes, that provided for religious freedom. He made sure taxes were the burden of taxes was spread out equally, and he advocated for trial by jury and equality. So, again, he ruled alone, but yet he did try to improve the lives of people, and I think he's the perfect example of an enlightened despot. All right, subconcept B states the ideas of Enlightenment philosophers as reflected in revolutionary documents, including the American Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, and Bolivar's Jamaica Letter, influence resistance to existing political authority. Notice that these three documents are specifically referenced. That means the odds of seeing them on the exam are very high. And obviously you want to compare the beliefs. All three documents were inspired by Enlightenment philosophers. Locke influenced the Declaration of Independence. Voltaire, influenced the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. And obviously Bolivar's Jamaica Letter would be influenced by, all of those philosophers. Subconcept C states that Enlightenment ideas influenced many people to challenge existing notions of social relations, which contributed to the expansion of rights, as seen in expanded suffrage, the abolition of slavery, and the end of serfdom. So that's the key here. You want to be able to explain how the Enlightenment not only led to more rights, but voting rights, the end of slavery, and the end of serfdom. The 13th Amendment's a great example of that, right? That abolishes slavery during the Civil War. In England in the late 1800s, in England in the early 1800s or late 1700s, the labor movement leads to more male suffrage, where in England you no longer had to own property to vote. That's not going to be the case in the United States in the late 1700s or early 1800s. By the mid 1800s, during Andrew Jackson's presidency, property qualifications will be eliminated as well. Remember, women are not voting until the early 1900s in the United States. So there's a continuation, right, where women's rights still lag behind men's rights. And we know that Alexander II emancipates serfs because of the failures of Russia during the Crimean War. So these are turning points. Most of Europe had abolished slavery by the, pretty much, I'd say the late 1700s and early 1800s. The only thing we did is we limited the slave trade. So we wouldn't abolish slavery until 1863, I believe. I forget, 1865, I think. Brazil would be the last country to keep slavery in existence, and that wouldn't be abolished until the late 1800s. All right, key concept 5.32 states, beginning in the 18th century, peoples around the world developed a new sense of commonality, right? Based on language, religion, social customs, and territory. These newly imagined national communities link this identity with the borders of state, while governments use this idea to unite diverse populations. So this is focusing on the emergence of nationalism. So two great examples would be the emergence of Italy as a unified nation. If you recall, we kind of talked about this a little bit. Italy was really divided among kingdoms and city-states, and eventually this count, the prime minister, a leader, not ruler, he was able to unite Italy under a king, and that king had to kind of abide by a constitution. And Cavour was he was compromising. He compromised with conservatives, but he himself was a liberal. He also believed in realpolitik. That's a great term to remember. Basically, practical politics. Yes, he would have preferred more of a truly democratic nation, but he recognized that to make everyone happy, he had to compromise and put Italy under a king. But the compromise was that he had to rule as per a constitution. Germany unites as well. Remember, Germany wasn't Germany. Germany was a region of many states, like Prussia, Austria, for example, some other Luxembourg, and basically under Otto von Bismarck, using war, he brings about German unification, and Germany then would be. The German Empire would be made up of Austria, Denmark, Prussia, and France, actually, or parts of France. after the fall of Napoleon. France or parts of France again would be under this or as part of this German empire. And we remember Bismarck for his reforms. He was concerned about the power of labor unions, workers growing more discontented, and so he kind of steps in and provides old age pensions and workers' compensation. He's going to resign eventually, and Wilhelm will take over. So Germany is an empire. Not a constitutional empire. It's not a democracy by any means. And that's kind of going to play into World War I. Another reason, perhaps, why we fought the Germans, because they were not a democracy. They were looking to overtake Europe and add to that empire. All right, key concept 5.33 states, increasing discontent with imperial rule propelled reformist and revolutionary movements. So this is the concept, or in this little piece, you want to be able to summarize some of those revolutions, right? The French Revolution, and then over here we have the Haitian Revolution. So we'll start with subconcept A, subjects challenge centralized imperial governments. So some examples of that would be the Taiping Rebellion. Don't forget, China had 2 rebellions. Remember, they were the Taiping over here in the yellow headgear. They were led by a Chu Quan, and they were frustrated with the Qing government that was Manchurian and kind of governed by the foreigners, right? They were frustrated with the lack of success in the Opium War. They were frustrated with Christian missionaries denouncing ancestor veneration and foot binding. So these Taipings were comprised of starving peasants and workers and miners, and tried to take over a coup, but the rebellion was put down by Qing supporters who wanted to maintain Confucian values and structures, and obviously the French and British didn't want to see their efforts to spread westernization and trade end. We didn't talk about the Marathas Rebellion. It is in the key concepts, and it's a simple piece that basically the Marathas or Marathas, it's in India. They were a group of they were Hindus, farmers, landowners, warriors, kind of a large collection of Hindus, and they were under the rule of the Mongols. Remember Akbar and the Mongols, and at that time India was kind of becoming a Muslim empire. So there was peace under Akbar, tolerance, right? We had mentioned that. But after he dies, conservative leaders returned the dynasty to a dynasty that favored Islam. We did discuss Akbar and toleration in Unit 4. So basically a rebellion would emerge between the Hindu majority. And remember, most people in India were Hindu. They were frustrated with a tax on alcohol. I'm sorry, on a religious tax, right? A tax that non-Muslims had to pay. Alcohol was forbidden, and as time would go on, Hindu temples and other icons were going into disrepair, and were just kind of disappearing. So basically, you'd have a rebellion emerge in and around 1620, where the Marathas would fight the Islamic Mughals, right? And a leader named Shivaji launched revolt. Not successful, but just understand that there was this, and we're going to see tensions in India between Muslims and Hindus in the 20th century as well. In fact, Gandhi was assassinated because of his attempts to kind of bring the two groups together. Gandhi was Hindu. All right, subconcept B states American colonial subjects led a series of rebellions, including the American, Haitian revolutions, and the Latin American independence movements. We remember those as the Creole revolutions, mostly. That facilitated the emergence of independent states in the U.S., Haiti, and mainland Latin America. French subjects rebelled against the monarchy, but as we know, at the end, they kind of, France returned to a monarchy in the years after the revolution. So what you want to focus on, a typical essay would be to compare and contrast these revolutions. So I think the main comparison would be these were, at least in the case of the American, French, and Creole revolutions, these were middle-class revolutions. So, for example, in the American Revolution, the middle class, the leaders of the American Revolution were landowners, George Washington, merchants, lawyers, prominent Americans who recruited and who led, the farmers. Right? America wasn't really there were really two classes. There was more of a working farmer class, and then there was the landowning class. Why did they revolt? I think, like the Creole Revolution, they were frustrated with British mercantilist practices, excessive taxation, limits on trade, for example. There was the Stamp Act, which was a tax on you had to pay extra for a newspaper or other items. The Sugar Act was limiting. The colonists had to purchase sugar from England only. So that's a trade limitation act. And then there was violence in the form of the Boston Massacre, which kind of pushed the colonists over the edge a bit. And then there was a tax, not a tax on tea, but the colonists were forced to only purchase tea from the East India Company. And that, again, limited their freedom to trade with outside parties, and that led to the shutting down of ports in Boston, or the Intolerable Acts. Again, the end result, like the Haitian Revolution, like the Creole Revolutions, you had an independent nation emerge. The French Revolution did not result in an independent nation. France remained France, right? The French people weren't looking for independence; they were looking for rights, and they were looking for a greater say in the government, and that's the French Revolution, right? So I think all these revolutions were inspired by the Enlightenment. That's a common denominator. The people of France, remember, France was divided into three estates. The first estate would be the landowning class, the royal class. The second estate would be the clergy, and then the third estate was everyone else, right? Your merchants, your small farmers, your peasants, your laborers, and they were paying the majority of taxes. They were frustrated with the growing poverty. When it came to voting in the Estates General, each estate had one vote. So the first two estates would always outvote the third estate. That was frustrating the leaders of the third estate. So a revolution would emerge in 1787. The storming of the Bastille is the symbolic moment where this prison was taken over, and that was used to store weapons as well. Unlike the American Revolution and the Creole Revolutions, there was a terror phase. So the revolution basically became radical. Maximilien Robespierre, who was a member of the Third Estate, but he was more of a leader, he formed a committee called the Committee of Public Safety, and he went around executing anyone who opposed his reforms, even a young boy who by mistake cut down a liberty tree. So he went after nobles, he went after the clergy, he went after even members of his own estate who didn't agree with him, or who thought he was too radical. Eventually he would be executed. The reign of terror would then give way to more of an oligarchy, where a directory of a few would govern, and then eventually we're going to see the emergence of an emperor, Napoleon. So you could argue that there were some changes made under Napoleon, right? Rights would be recognized, equal tax burden. So the revolution gave way to some positive changes, but France didn't become a true democracy like the United States for many, many years to come. Then we have the Creole Revolutions. We wrote a DBQ about that. Simon Bolivar would be the historical figure in his Jamaica letter, which was kind of a letter to encourage these revolutions. The result would be independence for the people of Venezuela and Colombia, Argentina, and eventually Brazil. Women gained very little from these revolutions in Latin America. Remember, there was Miguel Hidalgo, who led actually not a Creole revolution, but a mestizo and native revolution. But he too failed. Eventually, the Creoles gained control and governed. A common denominator would be not only independence from Spain, but freedom from those mercantilist policies that limited their wealth and prosperity. Okay. The Haitian Revolution, very different. It was a slave rebellion led by Toussaint d'Ouverture against the French in 1801. Once the rebellion came to an end, you had the first black nation, right? This was a slave rebellion, probably the most successful slave rebellion in the history of the world. As a result, a constitution did grant equality and citizenship. There were land reforms. Those slave plantations, the land was divided up to former slaves. But we don't see a true democracy because Toussaint governs, without without anyone electing him. Right? He's eventually, I think he's executed. But so some positive changes, but not a true democracy. But at least an independent Caribbean nation emerges. All right, so you should be familiar with the patterns of revolution. Again, all of these some of these patterns occurred in each revolution. I think the first one is common in all four. The citizens were dissatisfied with government, right, in some way or form. As time would go on, the moderates would gain more power. The Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution had that terror phase. They all had wars, right? All these revolutions used militaries to overthrow the imperial government, but I think a radical phase, maybe it just kind of would focus on the French Revolution, but a radical phase where, again, the revolutionaries turned on each other, right? And then there would be a period of relative calm and acceptance, or the Thermidorian reaction occurred in all of these revolutions, especially in the French Revolution. Unfortunately, that period of calm led to the emergence of an oligarchy and then an emperor in the form of Napoleon. Subconcept C states slave resistance challenged existing authorities in the Americas. Be able to identify an example of a slave rebellion. The Haitian Revolution is a great example of that. Nat Turner was a slave in Virginia who probably led the most successful rebellion in the United States, even though he was caught and killed. He murdered, dozens of slave owners and family members in Virginia. Harriet Tubman, obviously we know who she is. That's resisting, maybe not violently, but she definitely resisted by transporting escaped slaves to the north, Canada. And then maroon communities. These were escaped slaves in the Caribbean who helped in the French Revolution, right? I mean, in the Haitian Revolution, they freed themselves in a sense, but they returned to liberate their brethren, right? So maroon communities. Subconcept D states increasing questions about political authority and growing nationalism contributed to anti-colonial movements. So what are some examples of, again, the people in a colony rebelling against the imperial government? The Sepoy Rebellion, we mentioned that in the last concept, and the Boxer Rebellion are two great examples of anti-colonial movements. In a sense, the American Revolution to me was an anti-colonial movement, as was the Creole Revolution too. But don't forget Asia, right? We would lump them into these anti-colonial movements as well. These just weren't very successful. Some of the rebellions were influenced by diverse religious ideas. So the Sepoy Rebellion, again, the Sepoys were frustrated that they believed the British were trying to convert them or undermine their Hinduism by forcing them to use bullets that were greased with livestock fat. And then there's the Xhosa cattle killing movement. Again, the purpose of killing the cattle, the Xhosa people believed that spirits would rise and would, remove the British colonizers. But unfortunately, by killing the cattle and livestock, they ended up creating a famine, right? So again, religion was tied into the rebellion in a sense. That's not the case in the French or American Revolution. Any kind of religious or spiritual matter was not a cause of those rebellions. Key concept 5.34 states the global spread of European political and social thought and the increasing number of rebellions stimulated new transnational ideologies and solidarities. So you want to be able to summarize some of the new ideologies of those isms, right? So discontent with monarchist and imperial rule encouraged the development of political ideologies, including liberalism, socialism, and communism. Again, those terms are directly referenced, so you need to understand them. Socialism had been around in the 1800s as industry rose. Again, Marx was in theory, his beliefs were founded on socialism. He just went a little further. So socialism was this belief that the community, the workers, they control the means of production, the factories, the mines. They don't not all private businesses are owned by the community. So you might have some private ownership, some form of capitalism. But again, the major industries that produce things are going to be owned by society, or especially the workers would own that. It would occur gradually. Socialism doesn't happen overnight. Unlike communism, it goes a little further. And again, the goals are achieved through violence, and that's where Karl Marx comes in. He is frustrated with the struggling situation with workers. He's critical of utopian socialism that calls on people to separate. He doesn't believe socialism goes far enough, so he publishes his Communist Manifesto. He believes that there are two societies: the proletariat, or the workers, and the bourgeoisie that dominates society, and the workers are the victim. And so he calls on the proletariat class to stand up and go to war, revolt, and that's the difference. It occurs quickly through violence, or a violent uprising. Marxist socialism is more commonly known as communism. Think of community or coming together. Under communism, every corporation, business, and the means of production are all owned by the workers, or community control. There is no private ownership of business. That's not the case today in China. Things have changed a bit, but old school Soviet Union, nothing was owned privately. There is no private ownership, and I think that's the important. In theory, a communist government could be democratic, or it could be governed by a dictator, and that was the case going forward in the Soviet Union with Joseph Lenin. He was a dictator. All right, liberalism is an easy term to remember. It's not like a liberal today. A liberal today would be like Bernie Sanders, right? But a liberal back then would be the opposite. This idea of not the opposite, but complete freedom, especially when it comes to the economy. A liberal today would want more hands-on policies by the government. A liberal back then was like Adam Smith, right? Limited government interference, no mercantilist policies, but at the same time, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press. Okay, so it's a combination of individual freedoms, politically, socially, and economically. Conservatism back then was a little different. It would be more traditional government, and those traditional governments were monarchies, right? Absolute governments that controlled the economy and promoted mercantilism. Today, conservatism is a little different, right? It's more a hands-off policy in terms of the economy. So again, understand the differences, right? But again, liberalism is the key word is freedom, being free. And conservatism would go back to absolute government that controls all. All right, B. Demands for women's suffrage and an emergent feminism challenge political and gender hierarchy. So just examples of the growing women's suffrage movement. Mary Wollstonecraft would be a great fact to remember. Olympe de Gouges, a French feminist who writes the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. We remember her because she was executed by Robespierre during the Reign of Terror, because she was kind of, going against the male-dominated leadership. She was handing out pamphlets that stated women should have the same rights as French men, and that was a no-go for Robespierre. So she's a great person to remember as an early feminist. And then Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the United States. She organizes a women's suffrage conference in Seneca Falls, and it's there where she and her supporters issued the Declaration of Rights of Sentiment, one of the earliest women's suffragists. So, and women do achieve suffrage in 1919, so in the 19th Amendment. Or was it 1920? I think, I forget, but it was the 19th Amendment. So again, some of those examples of change, right? Or women who were trying to advocate for change. All right, that's it.